Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and when you think of rebels, you might not think of Rhode Island. But the governmental system of their state has been a rebel to the common American political system since the state's early history, and it persists into the 21st century. Find out how in this video on Rhode Island, the last rebel. Rhode Island and North Carolina stood out as states who objected to the Constitution that the Founding Fathers crafted in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, but Rhode Islanders would ratify it by 1790. However, the state of Rhode Island did not adopt a critical fundamental principle of American political ideology, the separation of powers. In that way, they stood out as rebels in the American political system until 2003. As Americans, we value the separation of powers. That is why we have independent judicial, executive, and legislative branches that provide a system of checks and balances to prevent an overstepping of one's power. The separation of powers was not a new concept in the late 1700s. We find separation of powers in Sparta, Rome, and other ancient civilizations to prevent one part of the government from taking over and becoming tyrannical, but it was Baron de Montesquieu in 1751 who clearly outlined the modern concept of the separation of powers. Montesquieu wrote that, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise, lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. Again, there is no liberty, if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. Were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. Were the same man or the same body, whether of the nobles or of the people, to exercise those three powers, that of enacting the laws, that of executing the public resolutions, and of trying the causes of individuals. Montesquieu's ideas permeated the thoughts and strategies of the Founding Fathers when constructing the Constitution. Some of the men most influenced were James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who saw the inclusion of three separate branches of government as the best way to form a stable government. Unlike her sister states, Rhode Island did not adopt a constitution during or immediately after the Revolutionary War, but continued to operate under a charter granted by King Charles II of England in 1663. The other states drew up constitutions, although not all of them would provide for a separation of powers. They would all eventually create that system, though. In 1776, Virginia was the first to do so, but many of the states sought to reduce the power of a central figure, the governor in the case of the states, and given more power to the legislature. When the Articles of Confederation were drawn up, they mimicked the many state constitutions. They emphasized the power of the legislature over the judiciary and the executive. When this system was deemed untenable by the states, they came together and drew up the Constitution that the U.S. has today. However, Rhode Island stuck with their original charter government from 1663. The power of the state legislature in that state caused it to refuse to go along with the Constitution initially, just like North Carolina had done. James Madison explained that the petty state of Rhode Island has obstructed every attempt to reform the government and repeatedly disobeyed and counteracted general authority. The General Assembly of Rhode Island possessed the most power in the state government, with its ability to control the actions of the judiciary and reduce the governorship to simply a figurehead with no real authority. Lord Acton stated that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This could not be more true than in the case of Rhode Island. The landowners, who controlled the General Assembly because only they and their firstborn sons were allowed to vote, preferred not to yield power. Owning land had always been a qualification for voting, but whether this was a liberal or restrictive qualification changed from time to time and place to place. In the 17th century, Roger Williams' settlement in Providence tried to distribute land equally among all settlers, while the Portsmouth settlement allocated land in proportion to one's wealth and social standing, allowing only a minority to vote. From 1723, the value of real estate that one had to own in order to qualify to vote was set by a statute that was uniform across the state. At first, this was considered a liberal reform, as voting rights were conferred broadly. Historians estimate that in 1723, 75% of the adult white male population owned enough land to qualify to vote, but as time marched on, the cities grew. An even smaller portion of the population was qualified to vote. By 1840, the situation had become patently undemocratic. Putting aside the issue that neither blacks nor women could vote, fully 2/3 of the adult white male population were disqualified from voting. Moreover, apportionment of seats in the General Assembly had been fixed 177 years earlier, and there was no mechanism for change. Providence, with a population of 23,000, held only 4 seats in the General Assembly, while Newport, with only 9,000 people, held 6 seats. In fact, a number of small towns enjoyed a greater representation than large cities, and that was just how the General Assembly and the landowners who controlled it wanted to keep it. The influx of immigrants and the natural growth of cities made the disparity in voting rights a horrendously large gap, where the people possessed little to no power. Only the rural elites could assert authority through the General Assembly. Their rural status led them to refuse the improvement of urban infrastructure. The ever-widening chasm between those who could vote and those who could not rose to unimaginable heights. In the early 1840s, a lawyer named Thomas Wilson Dorr led a group of reformers to change the government of Rhode Island to create a separation of powers and a more democratic government. He and the disenfranchised white men of Rhode Island elected delegates for a convention to create a new state constitution. They indeed created what they termed the People's Constitution, that expanded voting rights. The General Assembly, like you would assume, did not care for this action and declared martial law, arresting the ringleaders. Dorr had proclaimed himself governor and even met with President John Tyler to plead his case. But he was exiled from Rhode Island. He returned to the state with an armed force, but was confronted by the state militia. When he realized that fighting would lead to defeat, his army dispersed. He would be tried and convicted for treason and was sentenced to life in prison and hard labor. He would be released after 12 months, but would not recover from his imprisonment and die in 1854. Dorr's rebellion did bear some fruit, although it was more of a facade. The political pressure placed on the General Assembly led it to create a new constitution, abandoning the 1663 charter. However, it only expanded voting rights to a small degree and still kept the General Assembly as the supreme authority in the state, discarding the founding principle of the separation of powers. Rhode Island would continue to battle with legislative authority until the 21st century. On July 30, 2003, both the Rhode Island Senate and House unanimously approved a constitutional amendment incorporating the doctrine of separation of powers. Most likely, if the votes had been taken by secret ballot, the amendment would have been defeated. But democracy worked. Although it took many years, a concerted campaign of 9 years in the modern effort and 162 years since ratification of the People's Constitution during the Dorr Rebellion, the people finally got what they wanted. This was not a victory of elites, it was truly a victory of the people as a whole, who made themselves heard in community meetings, calls on talk radio, letters to the editors, discussions with candidates on the campaign stump, and letters and calls to legislators, and perhaps most importantly of all, their votes. The campaign was never backed by large sums of money or promoted by television commercials. The campaign succeeded because it resonated with the people from all walks of life and across ethnic, sociological, and economical spectrums. People may have never heard of Lord Acton or Montesquieu or read the Federalist Papers, and some may have needed a reminder about the concept of separation of powers, but they intuitively grasped the dangers of consolidated power and understood why the American founders divided the governmental power into 3 branches. Rhode Island was a rebel to the fundamental political beliefs of the United States Constitution that there needed to be a system of checks and balances to prevent one branch from gaining too much power. Its legislature battled with its citizens over voting rights, money allocation, and the distribution of political power, and after a couple hundred years, the government of Rhode Island was finally changed to reflect the political ideology of the country. Thank you all so much for watching. Please share the video to get the word out about the channel, and I'll see you next time.
Historian, where do you roam? Historian, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man. A professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.